Most people, when they want something from you, come to your door and ask. They knock, state their business, and wait for an answer. But there is another kind of asking, older than any door, older than any custom, that a certain kind of person uses instead. They watch. They study the shape of your life from a distance, how you move through your days, how you treat your animals, whether your land is respected or only used. They read you the way you read a letter, slowly, looking for what is actually there. And only when they have decided you are the person they need you to be, only then do they come down off the ridge and speak. Owen Greer had no idea he was being read, but he was about to find out what she had concluded. He looked east on the third morning, coffee still warm in his hand, and there she was. A figure on the ridge, still as the rock formations flanking it, watching his ranch from above with the kind of absolute stillness that takes either great discipline or great desperation to achieve. She had been there the first morning as a shape he'd almost dismissed as shadow. The second morning, he'd known she was human. By the third morning, he understood that she was waiting for something, and that whatever it was, she hadn't found it yet. Owen set down his coffee cup on the porch railing and stood for a moment looking back at her across the pale Arizona morning. He had lived in this valley for 11 years, and in that time had learned that most of what passed for conflict between the Apache and the ranchers in this part of the country started the same way, with one side deciding they already knew what the other meant before any words were exchanged. He had no intention of making that mistake. He left his rifle on the porch. The eastern ridge was a 20-minute climb through loose shale and juniper scrub, and Owen made it without rushing, letting his footsteps carry ahead of him the way you let a lamp precede you into a dark room, openly, giving the other person time to decide. When he reached the top, she was still there, standing in plain sight now, rather than held in shadow, as if she had decided that if he was coming up the slope, she was done pretending to be invisible. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, wearing a deerskin dress that had seen a great deal of hard country and moccasins worn thin at the heels from serious travel. Her hair was long and pulled back from a face that was angular and precise, built for reading distances, the kind of face that had spent its whole life outdoors and been sharpened by it rather than worn down. Her eyes were dark and absolutely steady. She did not step back as he approached. She did not reach for anything. She looked like a person who had already weighed the worst that could happen and made her peace with it. Owen stopped about 12 feet away. They looked at each other in the morning quiet. "I've seen you up here 3 days," he said. She did not respond immediately. When she spoke, her English was careful in the way of someone who had learned it deliberately rather than absorbed it. Each word placed with intention, the way a careful builder places stones. "I needed to know what kind of man lives here," she said. "And what did you decide?" Owen asked. She looked at him a moment longer, then she said, "I decided to come down and speak to you." He took that for the answer it was. "Come down then," he said. "I'll put coffee on." Owen Greer had not come west with ambitions. He had come west with what was left after ambition had been stripped away. A mule, a modest sum of money, and the specific and uncomplicated goal of putting enough distance between himself and the life he'd had in Virginia that the grief of it would eventually become manageable. His wife and their young daughter had died of fever in the early part of the 1860s, in a summer that felt, in memory, like it happened to a different man in a different world. Owen had moved west shortly after, not out of conviction about anything in particular, but because standing still had become intolerable, and the road at least gave him something to do with his hands, while his mind went on being broken. The valley had stopped him. He couldn't tell you exactly why. There was nothing obviously special about it. A shallow bowl between 2 ridges with sparse grass, and a creek that ran clear 7 months of the year, and barely at all for the rest. It was not lush country. It was not easy country, but it was honest country. It asked exactly as much of you as it needed to, and offered back exactly what it had, no more and no less. And after years in a world that had offered him considerably less than nothing, Owen had found that kind of straightforwardness something close to restful. He had bought the land from a man who'd failed at ranching and built a small herd over time, and over 11 years had made something modest but solid. Close to 200 head, a repaired cabin, a reliable well, the slow-built reputation of a man who paid his debts and kept his word. He had very few close acquaintances in the nearest town of Harlan Springs, 12 miles south. The people there knew him as reliable and honest, and they also knew, or had learned, that he was not interested in the particular social negotiations that men in that kind of territory were endlessly engaged in. He went to town when he needed supplies. He spoke when he was spoken to. He did not involve himself in the running politics of the frontier, which were in those years considerable and ugly, because someone was always trying to push someone else off land they needed and calling it progress. He had been doing his level best to stay out of all of it, and had been largely successful. The girl who walked back down the ridge beside him that morning was named Nara, a name she gave him simply and without elaboration somewhere on the descent through the junipers. Her people had been camped 2 ridges north for the past week, she said, traveling through on a route her family had used going back longer than anyone could remember, a corridor that ran through the high country in spring and came down toward the lower valleys as the season turned, following game and water the way the land itself directed. They had been making this particular passage every year for as long as the elders could recall. Owen listened to this and poured her coffee when they reached the cabin and set out what he had, which was cold cornbread from the previous evening. She accepted both without ceremony, drank the coffee slowly, and looked around the cabin with the same precise attentiveness she had shown on the ridge. Not nosiness, but assessment, the reading of a place for what it actually contained rather than what it appeared to contain. "You live alone here," she said. It was an observation rather than a question. "For most of 11 years, Owen said. She looked at him steadily. "My grandmother says you can read a man from how he keeps his land. She read yours before she sent me." A pause. "She said the fences are repaired where they need to be. The animals are not thin. The water is not wasted." Another pause. "She said that kind of land belongs to someone who is paying attention." Owen sat with that for a moment. "Your grandmother sounds like a careful woman." "She is the most careful person I have ever known," Nara said, and the way she said it made clear it was not a compliment she extended easily. He asked what had brought her to his ridge, and she took a breath that was brief but audible, the breath of someone who has been working toward a particular question for longer than the moment they're in. And she told him. For those of you just joining this story, now is a good time to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss where it goes from here. There was a land broker named Harlan Crandall, who had arrived in the territory 2 years earlier with a great deal of Eastern money and a way of talking about development and land rights that made you feel, in some persistent and difficult-to-locate way, that he was discussing you as if you weren't in the room. He had made Owen an offer on his valley the first year he arrived. Owen had declined. Crandall had smiled and said the offer would stand, and Owen had thought that was the end of it. He was revising that assessment now. What Crandall had been doing for the past 8 months was not immediately obvious to any single person in the valley, because he had been careful to distribute the pieces of it widely enough that no one person could assemble the whole picture from where they stood. He had filed reports with the Federal Land Office claiming that Apache families traveling the northern corridor had raided 3 homesteads in the area, burning structures and running off livestock. He had had water rights along the corridor reclassified through a procedural maneuver that was technically legal and practically devastating. cutting off the reliable water sources that Nara's people had depended on for the passage for generations. He had quietly blocked a supply route north of Owen's Valley with a new fence line, whose ownership was, to anyone who looked into it, deliberately unclear. And he had, in the general store and the saloon in Harlan Springs, been conducting a sustained and methodical campaign to convince the settled population of the valley that the Apache families in the region were dangerous, unpredictable, and a problem that the territory would be better off resolving definitively. In 3 weeks, there was to be a hearing at the federal land office in Harlan Springs, at which Crandall's application for a full land grant over the corridor would be reviewed. If the grant was approved, Nara's people would lose access to the only reliable spring passage through this part of the territory. The route they had traveled for generations would, in the particular language of land administration, simply cease to be available to them. And there would be nothing her people could do about it, because in that forum, in that year, in that territory, Apache testimony carried no legal standing whatsoever. Their word, however honest, counted for nothing in the room where the decision would be made. But Owen Greer's did. He had lived in the valley 11 years. He was known to the land agent. He had never filed a false complaint or spoken a dishonest word to anyone in authority. And he had seen, with his own eyes, things that directly contradicted every claim Crandall had filed. He had not connected those things into a pattern until this morning, sitting across a table from a young woman who had spent 3 days on a cold ridge, assessing whether he was worth approaching. Now, with the full shape of it visible, he understood exactly what he had been seeing for the past several months, and had been too focused on his own fence lines to look at clearly. The request Nara had come to make was this: would Owen Greer go to the land office hearing and tell the truth about what he had witnessed? He sat with that for a long time after she finished speaking. The morning had stretched past its early quiet into the full heat of mid-morning, and outside his window the land lay flat and dry and still, ordinary in every visible way, not looking like a thing about to change anyone's life. He thought about Crandall, smooth, patient, well-resourced, the kind of man who understood that sustained pressure outlasts most resistance if you apply it long enough. He thought about the ease of saying no, about how simple it would be to say this was not his fight, that he had his own land and his own concerns, and that what happened at a land office 12 miles south was a matter for people with more at stake than a man who only wanted to be left alone. He thought about that honestly. And then he thought about the fact that in his entire life he had never once felt better for choosing the easier thing when the harder thing was right. "Tell me everything you know about what Crandall has filed," he said, "and tell me who's going to be in that room." And something shifted in Nara's face when he said that. Not relief exactly, she was too composed for that, but a change in quality. The way a person's whole bearing subtly reorganizes when a weight they have been carrying alone is finally acknowledged by someone else. She told him everything she knew. In the days that followed, Owen wrote a great deal more than usual. He visited 2 homesteaders north of his valley, whose names Nara had given him. People who had been in the area for years and would have seen what he had seen. A woman named Vera Hutchins, who ran a small sheep operation, confirmed what Owen had begun to suspect, that the Apache families traveling the spring corridor had been known to her for years, and that in all that time there had been no raiding, no conflict, nothing that resembled the account Crandall's materials contained. She was direct about it. "What I have seen," she told Owen from her porch, "is Crandall's men riding through land they don't own and leaving gates open behind them and calling it a coincidence." She looked at him with sharp, tired eyes. "You going to the hearing?" He told her he was. She said she might come too. An older farmer further north named Amos Pratt said the same thing in fewer words and with considerable conviction. Owen also rode into Harlan Springs to speak with the land agent, a man named Forsyth, appointed to the position 3 years earlier and not corrupt so much as frightened, a man who had learned that people with Crandall's resources had a particular way of making life difficult for officials who didn't accommodate them, and who had been carefully, quietly accommodating for 2 years without doing anything obviously wrong. Forsyth was uncomfortable when Owen arrived and made a great many small, precise notes while Owen spoke. Owen told him he had documentation, his own ranch records, dates he had observed Crandall's riders in the northern range, a written account from Vera Hutchins. He told Forsyth he would be at the hearing. He told him Amos Pratt would be there as well. Forsyth said he would look forward to hearing from them in the tone of a man who means the opposite and knows he isn't fooling anyone. Crandall found out about the land office visit 3 days later. He was not a man who let information sit. 2 of his riders appeared at Owen's fence that same afternoon with the kind of message that is technically polite and functionally a threat. Mentions of untested water rights, of new federal land classification processes, of the standing offer on Owens Valley that remained open should he find himself reconsidering his circumstances. Owen listened to all of it from his porch with his hands in his lap, and when they were finished he said, "Tell Crandall I'll see him at the hearing." They rode away without another word. That night Owen sat at his table for a long time with a lamp burning low, and thought about all the ways this could go badly. He was not a man who pretended risk wasn't real, and Crandall's resources were not imaginary. There would be lawyers in that room. There would be documents and professional witnesses and the kind of sustained institutional pressure that wealthy men with legal backing could apply over months and years until the people opposing them simply ran out of energy and will. Owen had seen it before. He knew what it looked like. He also knew that Nara had spent 3 days on a cold ridge assessing whether he was worth speaking to. That her grandmother had read his land from a distance like a letter, looking for evidence of character in the way he maintained his fence lines and watered his animals. That both of them had decided after all of that careful attention that he was the person to ask. He did not know how to hold that lightly. He had lived alone for a long time, and the specific, unexpected weight of being trusted by someone who had every reason not to trust a man like him was not something he was willing to set down. He went to bed and slept reasonably well, which was its own kind of answer. Nara came twice more to his gate in the days before the hearing. The conversations were different from the first one. Less careful, the quality of mutual assessment replaced by something easier on both sides. She brought dried herbs the second visit, wrapped in bark, from her grandmother. The old woman had sent word that a tea made from them was good for the kind of headaches that came from sustained worry. Owen made the tea that same evening and found, to his genuine surprise, that it worked. The second visit Nara told him more about her grandmother. When Nara's people had debated whether to approach Owen at all, the old woman had been the one to argue that doing nothing was also a choice, and that its consequences were no less real for being quieter. The warriors had wanted to move on, to accept the loss of the corridor as one more loss and find a harder route further west. The old woman had said that accepting injustice in silence was how injustice learned to expand, and that she had seen enough of its expansion in her lifetime to know that accommodation did not stop it. It only moved the boundary further in your direction. Owen listened to this and thought that Nara's grandmother was the kind of person who should have been at every negotiating table in the history of this territory, and that the fact she had instead been forced to send her granddaughter to stand on a cold ridge for 3 days, waiting for a rancher to notice her, was not a reflection on the old woman's worth, but on the specific and persistent foolishness of the world she had been made to navigate. If you've been following this story and haven't subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of story we bring you every week. Go ahead and hit that button so you don't miss what happens next. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in the back room of the Harlan Springs land office, a space that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the accumulated weight of a great many decisions that had mattered more than the room they were made in suggested. Forsyth sat at a table at the front with a younger clerk beside him. Crandall was there with two men Owen didn't recognize, lawyers from the look of them, dressed for a different room than the one they were in. Several other settlers filled the bench seats, most of them tight-faced and uncertain, the way people are when they've come to watch something important happen and aren't entirely sure whose side they're on. Vera Hutchins was in the third row. Amos Pratt was beside her. Owen had not asked them to come. They had come on their own. Crandall's case was presented first, and it was smooth and well-organized and built to sound reasonable. Documented incidents, signed statements from men Owen had never encountered, maps presenting the corridor as a zone of established conflict and instability. The lawyers spoke with fluency and the particular technical confidence designed to make opposing arguments feel amateur by comparison. Crandall himself sat through it without speaking, watching Forsyth and watching Owen with the flat, measuring attention of a man who is accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room he enters. When it was Owen's turn, he stood and did not have notes. He had decided that reading from paper would make what he was saying feel like a prepared performance rather than what it actually was, which was a man telling the land agent the truth about what he had seen and heard in 11 years of living in this valley. He told it in order. He gave dates where he had them and said plainly when he didn't. He described the supply route blockage, Crandall's riders in the northern range, a conversation in the general store that had struck him at the time as oddly rehearsed rather than a genuine report. He told Forsyth what Vera Hutchins and Amos Pratt had each confirmed independently of the other. He said that in 11 years of ranching adjacent to the corridor in question, he had never seen the Apache families who traveled it do harm to a single settler or piece of property, and that the incidents attributed to them in Crandall's filings did not match any event he or his neighbors had any knowledge of. Then Vera Hutchins stood up without being called and said the same thing, shorter and sharper, in the voice of a woman who had spent 20 years running a sheep operation alone and had no patience left for anything that wasn't direct. Amos Pratt stood after her and said it again, even shorter, in the way of a man who has been silent for a long time and has chosen his words carefully and is only going to say them once. The room was quiet after that, in a way that was different from the quiet before the testimony had started. Crandall's lawyers made several arguments. Crandall himself said one thing, in a voice that was controlled, but had something running under the control that Owen recognized as the particular anger of a man who has carefully arranged a room and cannot understand why people will not stay where he put them. Forsyth asked for a week to review the submitted materials. At the end of it, he issued a ruling that the land grant application for the corridor in question was deferred pending further investigation, and that the incident reports filed on behalf of Crandall's operation could not be corroborated by independent witnesses and would be set aside in the current proceeding. It was not a complete victory. Deferred was not denied. Crandall still had money and lawyers, and the patient determination of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through attrition. But it was something. It was enough that Nara's people could continue their spring passage for at least another year, without the threat of federal action closing the corridor behind them. It was enough that Forsyth had seen, in one room, that Crandall did not have the unanimous support of the valley he claimed to represent. And it was enough that 3 people had stood up and said the truth out loud where it could be recorded, which meant it existed in a way it hadn't before. Owen rode home that afternoon feeling something he identified, after a moment's honest reflection, as tired but not empty, which was different from the way he'd felt at the end of most days for the past several years. Nara was at his gate when he got back. She had been waiting in the late afternoon light, her arms at her sides, watching him ride in with the same precise attention she had brought to every conversation they'd had since the ridge. "Forsyth deferred the grant," Owen said when he dismounted. She was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother will want to know what you said in that room. Tell her I told the truth. That's all I did." Nara looked at him steadily. "She will say that is enough," she said. "She will also say it is never only that." Owen thought about this. "She'd be right," he said. Nara left before the sun finished going down, back up the trail toward her people's camp. And Owen watched her go and then walked to his porch and sat with the stillness of a man at the end of a day that had been long and full and had required him to be a different version of himself than the one he'd been maintaining for some years. He felt, in a way that was quiet and not dramatic, but entirely real, that something had shifted. Not in the land or the valley or the political situation, which would go on being contested and difficult in all the ways that contested situations always are. But in him, somewhere in the preceding weeks, the careful distance he had kept between himself and the world outside his fence line had closed. Not collapsed, but deliberately closed because he had decided that it was no longer the right distance to maintain. And he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not regret it. Her people broke camp 4 days later and moved north on the corridor they had traveled since before Owens Valley had a name on any map he'd ever seen. Nara came the morning before to tell him, the way she had come both times before, and she stood at his gate differently now, not less precise, but less guarded, the way a person stands when they have decided that the man on the other side of the fence has earned a different version of their attention. She had something from her grandmother, a small piece of worked leather, tooled with a pattern Owen did not recognize, which she told him to hang at his gate. If any of her people came through and saw it, they would know the ranch was a safe place to approach. Not many people outside the tribe had ever been given one. Her grandmother had said he should understand what it meant before taking it. Nara explained it plainly. It meant protection in one direction and obligation in another. Her people would leave him and his land alone. In return, when honesty was called for in the future, he would be expected to offer it. Owen took the marker and turned it over in his hands. "Tell your grandmother I said thank you," he said, "and tell her the trade is fair." Nara almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that it was clearly visible, a brief warmth arriving in an expression that had been built for serious distances. "She already knows," she said. She said she would have expected nothing less from the kind of man who keeps his fences repaired. She walked back up the trail, and Owen watched her go over the ridge until the desert light swallowed her. Then he walked to his gate and hung the marker where it could be seen clearly from the road. One of his ranch hands noticed it that same afternoon and didn't ask. The other noticed it the next morning and said quietly, "That from the camp up north?" Owen said it was. The man nodded and went back to work without another word, which was exactly why Owen had kept him on. The corridor stayed open that year and the next. Crandall made 2 more attempts at the land office over the following 18 months, both of which ran into the same problem his first attempt had. A record now showing that his filed incident reports were contradicted by multiple independent witnesses, which made it considerably harder for Forsyth to look the other way with a comfortable conscience. Vera Hutchins filed a formal complaint about the blocked supply route and got it reopened. Amos Pratt told 3 other settlers what had happened at the hearing, and 2 of them started paying closer attention to Crandall's operations than they had before. Crandall noticed this and did not enjoy it, and eventually redirected his attention to territory further east where the resistance was thinner. None of this resolved everything. The pressure on Apache families traveling traditional routes through the territory did not disappear because one land grant application had been deferred. Owen understood this and did not mistake a single hearing for a permanent settlement. He kept his records carefully, maintained his fence lines, kept the marker at his gate where anyone coming down the road could see it. Each spring, the Apache families came through the corridor. Not all of them stopped at Owen's ranch, but some did. Occasionally to water horses at his trough, occasionally to ask about the terrain south of the valley or the state of the creek. He answered what he could and offered water without conditions, the same way he had always offered water, because it seemed to him, as it had always seemed to him, that offering water to a person who needed it was not a complicated or heroic act. It was just what you did when you had a well and someone else was thirsty. Nara came back every spring. Not always for long, and the conversations varied. Sometimes practical, sometimes longer, sometimes carried in the kind of comfortable quiet that two people share when they have been through something together and no longer need to fill every silence with words. She told him more about her grandmother over the years, who lived to a great age and continued each spring to read the land around Owen's ranch from a distance before declaring herself satisfied. She told him about her people's history in the corridor, the water sources and seasonal patterns, and accumulated knowledge of a landscape that settlers in the territory were still in the process of mapping and misunderstanding. Owen listened. He found over time that listening was teaching him things about his own land that 11 years of living on it alone had not. Comment below. Would you have done what Owen did? Would you have walked into that land office and said what you'd seen, knowing what it might cost you? We'd really like to know what you think. There is a particular kind of respect that does not announce itself or look for acknowledgement. It grows in the space between two people who have watched each other act according to their actual values, not their stated ones, who have seen what each other does when it is difficult and costly rather than when it is easy and comfortable. Owen Greer had started that spring as a man who was very deliberately keeping to himself, who had built a life around the idea that the best way to avoid losing anything else was to stop caring about anything beyond his fence line. And then, a young woman had appeared on his ridge and waited 3 days to make sure he was worth speaking to, and her grandmother had read his land from a distance like a letter, and the careful distance he had been maintaining had closed. Not because he had been moved by sentiment, but because he had been presented with a clear question and had sat with it honestly and had found that there was only one answer a man of his actual convictions could give. He had testified. He had told the truth in a room where it was inconvenient to do so. He had hung a piece of worked leather at his gate and stood behind what it meant. What he had gotten in return was not safety. The frontier was never safe, and not resolution, because these things never fully resolve. What he had gotten was something harder to name, but easier to feel. A sense that the life he was living had its edges in the right places. That the quiet of his valley, which had always been a kind of refuge, was now something more than that. It was a home. And the difference between a refuge and a home, Owen had come to understand, was simply this. A refuge is a place you go to be left alone, and a home is a place you have chosen to be responsible for. There is something the West produced in those years that the louder stories missed entirely. Not the gunfighter or the outlaw or the lone hero riding against impossible odds. It produced quiet men who made careful choices in ordinary moments, who chose to go up a ridge instead of staying on the porch, who chose to stand up in a land office and say what they had seen rather than stay comfortably invisible, who chose to hang a marker at their gate and show up for what it represented, one spring at a time, for as long as it took. Those men did not make the histories, but they made a great deal of what was actually worth keeping. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories from the frontier coming every week, and each one has something in it worth carrying with you. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Owen's place? And if you have a story from the Old West you'd like us to bring to life, let us know. Your voice is what keeps these stories going.